Hi, I'm Jolly Patel.
And I'm Robert Sharetta, and this is International Investor. First, I want to thank you, Jolly, for flying in all this way just to help us introduce this program, which is focusing on dark swans.
Well, that's pretty ominous, Robert, and I know from my experience in the financial field that dark swans usually pertain to unforeseen shocks in the financial market. And I know that you've been an analyst for a long time trying to anticipate and calculate unforeseen and unexpected risks in the market.
That is correct. And Jolly, in this context, we want to carefully describe what we mean by dark swans. And by our definition, International Investor, we're referring to those catastrophic events that could severely disrupt the entire world economy.
But by catastrophic events, we're not talking about natural disasters, are we?
No. In our analysis, although such events as earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and floods, and even hurricanes, the kind that affect the region of the world where you're from, can have local and sometimes even regional and disastrous effects, they are short-lived in nature, and they don't qualify as far as we're concerned.
Yes, and by some estimates, they even stimulate the local economy with repairs and reconstruction, and thus offset the immediate impacts with a short and intermediate boost for the very economies that were struck. But what about global warming and climate change? There is near hysteria about the impact, even economic effects of these trends.
With a 50 to 100-year horizon, the effects are simply not of our interest for this report. And we argue that nations have learned to adapt to such changes, if you look at the historic record, when they had that much time to do so. We simply don't believe that current weather events are an immediate result of all these factors, but rather a new intensity of appraisal and interest that the same events simply didn't receive in the past. We also differ from the military and intelligence community assessments in one other important respect.
We are also not talking about wars and conflict for the same reason. They're usually regional in nature.
That is correct. So while the Pentagon and the CIA do a lot of scenario planning for breakout wars with China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, we don't believe they rise to the level of severe economic global devastation that we will outline on this program. We think they lack the imagination and ability to foresee the real prospects for calamity that we're going to be identifying today. So we are now going to focus on those plausible calamities that we believe have at least a significant chance of occurring in the next decade, and which would severely damage and disrupt the economies of the world.
Well, let's get started. What do you believe is number one?
At the top of our list is a cyber crash. The very real prospect that the internet, the World Wide Web, will deteriorate in security to the point where people will no longer trust it for transactions or their personal interactions.
The number of increasing incidents of hacking, piracy, and loss of privacy on the internet has reached dramatic levels. Just look at some of the most recent examples of intrusions into our government and the private sector.
By some estimates, the Chinese alone have stolen $300 billion in intellectual property from American companies and our government in the last year alone.
Robert, if the internet breaks down, that's going to have a dramatic impact on the world economies in the Western world. Over 50% of our economic growth and expansions have been dependent on the new digital economies over the last 2 decades.
That's right. It's the fundamental building block in our transition from a manufacturing economy to an information-based economy, and one that is providing the bulk of our new company growth, our economic expansion, and new jobs.
And the emerging markets of the world are just beginning to use cellular and mobile technologies to boost their commerce and trade.
We think the impact will be measured in trillions of dollars and set the world economy back several decades if this continues to unfold.
Robert, I understand you caught up with an interesting guest. Let's go to the interview now.
In our estimation, we're doing a report on this. We think you guys are losing this battle. We're actually looking at some consumer surveys indicating people are losing confidence because of the magnitude and scale of some of these attacks and the number of people having identity theft, etc. We're also hearing from the retailers that they're seeing not just an immediate loss afterward, but conversion to cash. Overall, we're starting to look at a picture indicating that we think the loss of confidence by consumers, by small businesses in particular, is going to change the scale and scope of the information economy in the future as a result of all this.
I think that's a legitimate concern. It's sort of the big question that people worry about is, are we at a point where the costs outweigh the benefits? And I'm not going to say who it is, but I was briefed in privately to a research report that's going to be coming out soon. I'm not going to say who it is to steal their thunder, but they found that the costs are now outweighing the benefits, which is like, whoa, wait a minute, seriously? That's someone's actually done the math on this. So yeah, I think we could be at a point, and again, lots of people say, oh, the security vendors were just trying to say how bad things are so you buy our stuff. These messages are not coming from the security crowd. It's coming from people like yourself who are outside looking at the effect on everyday people, which I think is significant.
That's a frightening concept, but I understand our second dark swan is your concern with the world debt.
Absolutely correct. And I think what we are seeing in Greece and Puerto Rico today is just one manifestation of that. The world's debt, as measured by national government bond holdings and commercial loans, has truly reached astronomical proportions. Just look at these charts and estimates.
And added onto that has to be local government debt. In China and in countries around the world, municipal debt is not as carefully monitored as other large debts might be.
And here in the United States, we have a growing state pension debt problem that no politician is able or willing to solve. But do you know what my biggest worry is right now, Jolly?
Interest rates rising?
That's right. Ever since the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve here in the United States and other central banks of the world have fought to drive interest rates down or close to zero, making it almost free of charge to borrow money. If those interest rates start rising too fast, there's going to be many more Greek crises around the world.
Robert, between those first two dark swans, we could see a serious stagnation or collapse with many economies around the world. That could sow the seeds of our third dark swan, which is the mass migrations.
Well, Jolly, I know we have seen a lot of refugee crises around the world, in such places as Northern Africa, Central America, the Middle East, and even the Rohingya in Asia.
But Robert, we believe this is just the first ripple in what we project will become tsunamis of large-scale human migrations moving around the world. Already, the head of NATO in Europe believes more than 500,000 sub-Saharan Africans are beginning to move towards Libya in an effort to eventually reach the shores of Europe.
And by some estimates, we already have millions of people who have fled countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria to other nations like Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. But you think this situation is going to get even worse?
Yes, the issues we see in Asia seem less about conflict and more about economic and religious discrimination. In Central America, migration seems to be exacerbated by both impoverishment and a complete breakdown of security.
Both of which we believe are related to the economic stresses that people in these lands are undergoing. You know, Jolly, with few job opportunities and only illegitimate means to survive, these people have no choice.
And the internet is showing them that there is a better life elsewhere, and smuggler websites are teaching them how to get there. But Robert, my greatest fear is that for a lot of women and children, that can mean sex exploitation.
That is one of the reasons I wear this band on my wrist. It's the supporter group that combats that kind of illicit business. But when people are fleeing across nations, they become very vulnerable. And even men, as well as women and children, can end up in forms of indentured servitude and situations that amount to human slavery.
We are already seeing it. Just look at the rise in human slavery on these graphs. We caught up with someone who studies migrations. Let's go to that interview now.
Well, thanks for being with us. A couple questions we had for you. One I raised from the audience earlier, and that is, we're starting to see, of course, refugee crises, but we're thinking more of economic and environmental displacement. If countries don't step up and help some of the poverty and some of the other issues in some of these nations, are we going to see more migrations in the future? Are we going to see more economic and environmental refugees?
There is hardly any doubt about that. I mean, the difference in living standard between Europe and the United States on one hand and parts of Africa, for instance, on the other is so enormous that, of course, a lot of people will come if they can. And the only long-term solution to this is to increase the development, reduce the poverty in Africa and few parts of the world, to make sure that there are no environmental catastrophes which will really push people out.
And Jolly, we think this situation will get worse as economic stagnation forces tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions from China, India, Southeast Asia, African states, Latin and Central American countries, and particularly the Middle East to desperately search for a better life for their families, or any life at all, but elsewhere. We believe this will prove to be very costly and extremely unsettling for the host nations receiving them, and will bring the rise of extremism and violence on a multi-regional scale, which will have a huge impact on the global economies.
You know, Robert, with great numbers of people roaming the earth and crossing borders, it not only puts a strain on the receiving societies, but poses other risks as well.
Which brings us to dark swan number 4, the growing risk of pathogens being introduced internationally and becoming worldwide pandemics.
Robert, with the rise of such diseases as Ebola in Africa, where we had a scare in 2014, and MERS spreading in the Middle East to Asia, and avian flu coming out of China and spreading to chicken farms in the US, it suggests that diseases could be spreading more readily, not just across human populations, but to livestock and crops as well, threatening their yields.
Yes, Jolly, but you know, it's hard to get hard numbers on this because much of it is just sheer speculation. But I do know that the Disease Control Center in Atlanta is very concerned about pandemics. And I'm even more worried about the kinds of diseases that can devastate crops or livestock populations and further exacerbate famines and food shortages around the world.
Yes, I understand that the agricultural department in the US is very alarmed about the spread of the Chinese bird flu that has now resulted in the slaughter of hundreds of millions of chickens in the US. And as a result, the price of eggs as well as chickens is soaring. We caught up with someone who can give us an insight into how big a calamity this could be. Let's listen now.
Will increasing urbanization result in more healthcare challenges, and particularly the spread of disease?
I think you're right, because healthcare is a very important issue. The healthcare issue, the real issue has been that the public healthcare system has broken down to a certain extent. The government hospitals are not able to cope with the increasing population, nor are they equipped with sufficient staff and resources to really handle this. But urbanization and epidemic diseases, I think it's both, you know. I think there's a worry about the diseases and the non-treatable, you know, antibiotic resistance infections and so on. And I personally feel the greater challenge is to give basic health care to your population.
You know, Jolly, there is one more dark swan that international investor has identified, and it's been hanging over our heads literally for 70 years.
Aha, the nuclear problem. Robert, you know that for all that time, the nuclear club, as it's known, has been composed of barely a handful of players, as the rest of the world was willing to forswear that they would not use the bomb themselves. But you seem concerned that things are changing.
Indeed, Jolly. Some time ago, we did our report on the number of Asian nations that were beginning to experiment with technological research in the nuclear realm. They were installing nuclear research facilities and power plants. 17 in all, we counted. In addition to Iran, we know that Saudi Arabia is strongly considering its own development of nuclear power and perhaps weaponry.
What do you believe is driving this need to acquire nuclear weapons?
Fear and simple history. I think nations around the world have taken note that such actors as Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, leaders in the Ukraine, and the president of South Africa, and several other nations have come to regret the decision to give up their nuclear weapons programs. You know, several of these nations have been attacked and invaded or feel much more threatened today because they lack the omnipotent power as a nuclear nation. Political leaderships across the world have learned the lesson and have vowed to not be in that same position. We at International Investor believe nuclear proliferation is taking place, and those that can't build nuclear programs will simply conspire to steal, beg, or borrow them from elsewhere. But that is not my biggest fear. I believe that all of this technology and the nuclear waste that it produces will eventually fall into the wrong hands.
Enrichment and reprocessing are the two steps where special nuclear materials are made, and that can be used for weapons or for reactor fuel. I focus on the reactor side of it, but it's hard to really separate those two aspects. There's a lot of reactors in the region and heavy dependence on nuclear power. So still, I want to make sure everyone, this is operational. The current number of reactors, China and South Korea there are somewhere in the mid-20s. Japan has 43 currently, but only one operating. And reactors under construction, Japan has those two listed. It's unclear what will happen with them. China and South Korea both have several reactors. China has 24 under construction, 43 more planned, and quite an ambitious schedule for those two. But in general, you also see in the global context, construction, about half of global construction is occurring in Northeast Asia.
Robert Chiretta with International Investor. You mentioned very briefly that there's still a lack of storage for waste materials in this region of the world. There is here as well, I might add. But I wonder if you could comment on how you see the accumulation of the waste materials, and at any point does it become problematic?
Well, first, thank you for the question. Sure. This is both a safety and a security issue. And at Fukushima, we did see this where reactor 4, there were 6 units on site, 4 of them were damaged, the units 1 through 4. 4 was not operating, but its fuel pool was almost full. And in fact, it was stacked in a way that may not be allowed in the United States. Because if you lose coolant in it, that fuel is, because the fuel is still hot, even though the reactor is off. And it goes through a long decay heat process. So that you put it in the pools to keep it cool for a few years until it can maybe be moved out. But as far as that on-site pool storage in Japan, those, like at Fukushima, those reactors have been running since the late 60s. I think Daiichi 1 came online or maybe it was 72 it came online. Anyway, for about almost 40 years. So a lot of fuel has built up. And I mentioned Rokasho has never operated. They've never had commercial reprocessing.
So, it's not the nuclear bomb?
No, it's the dirty bomb. The explosion that is not nuclear in nature, but uses radioactive waste to render large areas useless for future generations.
But that would be like a regional war, localized.
Yes, but if it targeted, for example, the port of Los Angeles, it would not just devastate that immediate area, but it would bring world trade to a halt as the cleanup and investigation ensued, and that period would be followed by a call to begin checking the importation of all cargo thoroughly, not just the 2 or 3% we are currently examining. And boy, would that crimp world trade and the global economies for decades to come, and the cost would be measured in trillions of dollars.
That sure would slow things down. Well, Robert, those are truly the darkest of dark swans that I could have ever imagined. Here's to hoping that none of them transpire in the near future, but I think we are right in trying to alert the world to the possibilities. So, for International Investor, I am Jolly Patel.
And I'm Robert Sharetta for International Investor. Good night and good luck.